Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Western EIM Regional Issues Forum meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. And as a reminder, this conference is being recorded. And with that, I'll turn the call over to Pam Sporberg, Regional Issues Forum Chair. Please go ahead.
Hello, and welcome to another virtual meeting of the EIM Regional Issues Forum. This meeting marks 1 year of virtual meetings that we've been having for this forum, and so thank you for adapting and continuing with us through this new format. We have identified quorum for the EIM sector liaisons through the attendee list, so we can quickly move on to our first panel. Our first panel today will be on resource sufficiency and resource adequacy. And I will introduce the facilitator for the panel, who is Lisa Tawney. Lisa was appointed to the Oregon Public Utilities Commission by Governor Kate Brown in June of 2018. She represents Oregon on the Electricity and Critical Infrastructure Committees for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. She also serves on the Energy Trust of Oregon's Board of Directors, and importantly for our forum, she is the chair of the Energy Imbalance Market Board of State Regulators, or BOSSR. So with that, I will turn it over to Lisa to introduce and facilitate our panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, and thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this RIF panel. I think we have an excellent panel to explore a variety of perspectives on how the EIM sufficiency tests performed last summer and how they perhaps need to evolve and change, and how we reinforce sufficiency across the region effectively. From a logistics perspective, I just want to say, I know usually during the RIF there's questions and so on. We're going to work our way through this panel in a roundtable conversational format, and I think if you have questions, Pam will have some options at the end. But we have a fair number of panelists, and so we're just going to dive right in. You know, this issue really dominated the body of state regulators last meeting because the perception of leaning and sufficiency is really challenging and central to how regulators think about the market and how the market operates in a fair way across the whole region. We want to really be sure, I think, as a trust-building exercise, but also just for long-term sustainability, that the market's operating really effectively, in line with sort of the expectations that everyone entered with. And so when we observe the summer events and start to see emergent behavior that doesn't match that, we, as the regulators, are really interested in what happens next. How do we address that? And so I'm really pleased to get to join this conversation because I think I have a lot to learn from our speakers and from the dialogue here. I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Simons with the Bonneville Power Administration. He's been with Bonneville for 14 years and is currently the acting supervisor of market pricing and policy within the Power Services Bulk Marketing Organization. He has 25 years of experience with energy industry, including structured retail and wholesale power transactions, market design, and policy development. We also have Partha Malvadkar, the Senior Manager of FERC and Kaiso Policy at PG&E, where he's worked in various roles over the last 10 years. And prior to that, he spent 10 years at FERC, primarily focused on RTO market design issues, and with the House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. We're also really lucky to have Bobby Olson. He's with the Salt River Project out of Phoenix, Arizona, and he's been with SRP for 16 years, spent the last 4 in his current role as the Director of Supply and Trading in Fuels. He also has a background in plant engineering, operations and fuel procurement, as well as energy markets. So a little more on the concrete and in addition to the energy markets. Finally, we have Clay MacArthur, Vice President of Power Marketing at Deseret Power, based in South Jordan, Utah. and he currently serves as one of the EIM Regional Issues Forum's publicly owned utility sector liaison. So I'm sure you all know him already. Deseret Power's coal-fired Bonanza resource has been in the EIM since 2017. So we're going to begin our discussion with some slides from Mark and Partha setting up the problem definition from their perspective. And then we're going to turn to a discussion about the tests themselves. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mark.
Thanks, Commissioner Tani. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here today and participate in this panel with this selection of colleagues. It's really a great opportunity, so thank you for offering it to us. Do we have the slides available on? There we go. Thank you. So again, my name is Mark Simons. I'm with the Bonneville Power Administration, and as Commissioner Tani indicated, I'll be providing an introduction here this morning. So next slide, please. Or actually this afternoon, sorry. So to set context, the first two key questions are, what is it? What is this resource sufficiency evaluation that the panel is going to be talking about, and why does it exist? So to do this, we've crammed a couple of things on the slide here. It's really the resource sufficiency evaluation in the energy imbalance market is composed of 4 different tests that are outlined on the screen here. So there's a balancing test, a bid range capacity test, a flexible ramp sufficiency test, and a transmission feasibility test. Those are the 4 tests, and they're performed hourly for each of the EIM balancing authorities and the Kaiso balancing authority. And I just want to call attention to the type and timing that are here on the right-hand side as well, because the way the test is ultimately used is not necessarily the same from test to test. That's not an indication of whether it should or shouldn't be, but it's just a fact that they're different. The balancing test is financially binding. The bid range and flex ramp tests can have physical impacts that were seen in the heat wave of summer 2020. And the transmission feasibility test, or feasibility test for short, is non-binding, neither financial or physical impacts. So that's what they are. The question next is, why do they exist? And so to capture that, we look back at the resource sufficiency white paper from September of 2018 that the ISO produced, and really the purpose was captured there as ensuring each EIM entity can adequately balance their own supply and demand prior to participating in the energy imbalance market. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next, we move on to, what are we talking about? So it's not just a test. It's an evaluation that occurred during a heat wave, and we have some examples to look at here. And you know, a number of us really have an affinity for this slide that's been produced by PowerX that goes through the transfers into and out in a small amount of the Kaiso Balancing Authority area during the heat wave last August. And importantly, this covers the 5-day span from August 14th through August 18th. And there's a lot of information captured here, but in short, the blue bars are the transfers, EIM transfers. Positive numbers indicate exports, negative numbers indicate imports, as you can see on the left-hand side. The shading of these areas indicates a stage 2, or in the darker shade at the very top, a stage 3 energy emergency alert. The red bars indicate within that time period where the physical implications of the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation results were binding upon the Kaiso. So again, these are times when the Kaiso balancing authority failed the test and there were binding impacts upon the imports. So those are the red bars, and you can see that they are not coincident with the entire time frame in which the alerts take place. But they tend to happen, with the exception of the one on Sunday, August 16th, they tend to happen inside the time period when these when these emergency periods are happening. So what that shows us is that despite a period in which these alerts are taking place, in which all energy resources have been deployed by the ISO, the Kaiso Balancing Authority continued to pass under these conditions. And that warrants some questions about, is that appropriate for the Balancing Authority to continue to pass? And that's applicable to any Balancing Authority. That's not any particular observation about the Kaiso Balancing Authority. And then in addition to some of those times when passing, which are the blue areas that are within the shading, it's also important to note that there are upwards of 2,000 or sometimes during the blue, during these emergency periods, 2,500 megawatts worth of imports in the EIM during these emergency conditions. And it's worth a discussion as to whether that's an appropriate use of the EIM and the conditions that encourage or incent this type of behavior. And the reason that's important is this piece down here at the bottom. The particular way in which these actions take place as a result of a failure of the EIM resource sufficiency test are that the imports are frozen. In other words, they can't continue to increase the amount of imports that they're taking in. There's essentially a floor put on the bottom during a failure of the resource sufficiency test, and that's why you see some of these, like for example on August 14th, it walks down a little bit as the hour changes from 2,000 to 1,500. So that's a result or at least there's an illustration of the fact that the test was binding during that period. Next slide, please. So that sets up the problem and the issue identification that we're after here in this discussion of the panel. And the next question is to then look at the proposed enhancements to the resource sufficiency evaluation. And so there are three, and there's broad support for these enhancements to the resource sufficiency test. First of all, number one in the right-hand corner, appropriately accounting for the resource derates and re-rates. Secondly, there is the correcting of the mirror resources. These two are both defects that the ISO identified when they went back and reviewed the test results during this heat wave period, and they're committed to correcting them and proposing to do so in their draft final proposal. In addition, the third item, the ISO is proposing adding an uncertainty element to the test. And so what we wanted to do was then look at the combination of these three things and evaluate its impact on the test. And so the ISO did this for two of the items, the first two, during their January 13th workshop. And that's where you get the change from the orange line moving up to the blue dotted line, and the orange bar moving down to the blue bar. And We then, here at Bonneville, added this third element, which is, okay, if you have the uncertainty, what is our estimation of its impact on this particular graphic? And that's what the red dotted line represents. So from that, we draw two conclusions for this discussion. One is, even after the enhancements, a significant amount of capacity remains shown, and this is illustrated by the blue bars. So this is specifically bid range capacity that continues to be shown within the ISO balancing authority area in the range of 2,500 megawatts during the periods in which they've failed and the periods in which the energy emergency alerts are in force, which indicate that all energy resources are being utilized. So that's one observation, that the blue bars continue to show significantly positive values. The second is, in our estimation, the pass-fail rate for the ISO balancing authority would remain unchanged following the implementation of these three enhancements. And we think that warrants further discussion. So what remains to be done? Next slide, please. So the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation really needs to be an accurate, effective, and equitably applied test for all EIM entity balancing authority areas and the ISO balancing authority area. And that requires further discussion on the two items at the top of the slide. The true operating capability of each balancing authority area. So, for example, if a balancing authority is in an energy emergency alert, does it continue to show 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts of bid range capacity available? And if so, why does that continue to manifest itself? There could be some reasons why, and we'll get into those here in just a second. But having understanding of that helps with what Commissioner Taney indicated at the outset, confidence in the market operations and the entities participating in it. The second is the test should proactively prevent leaning. So clearly that's part of the why in terms of why the test was constructed. And so there should be some dialogue about specifically what are individual entities and market participants' interpretation of that. And so we'll talk about that here in just a second. And that'll be a clear subject of the discussion of this panel as well. So the next two things are the second and third bullets on the slide. In order to build this confidence and understand the true operating capability so that we can have an effective discussion about the concepts of leaning or not leaning, let's diagnose and prioritize the enhancements, additional enhancements beyond the three that are already done, and do so through a crosswalk of the capacity that's actually shown for resource sufficiency and the actual operational capability and the operating hours in which it exists. There's 6 examples here that could contribute to things to look at during such an exercise. You know, resource ramping, is the bid range that's included in the test actually accessible in the intervals being tested and evaluated? Transmission deliverability, this may be something that some of the panelists speak to. Is the bid range stranded behind a binding transmission constraint? And if it is that appropriate for inclusion? Is it feasible for inclusion? Uncertainty. So some work has been done here. I think recent indications from the MSC might indicate that more work could be done here to better understand the net load and interchange uncertainty and whether that's sufficiently accounted for. Demand response, for example, did quantities included in the test perform during the heat wave? And similarly, resource underperformance. Is it still an issue after the known D rates and re-rates have been accurately applied? And then finally, reserve obligations. Is the reserve treatment within the test, is it durable during these periods of emergency action? And are there any changes that should be considered? With all this being investigated, there's really two things that warrant a process for ongoing and transparent review, and that is the test result that we've discussed a couple of slides before, and then following up on any changes that we do along the way and ensuring that they are both implemented properly but also working as intended. So in short, resource sufficiency is foundational to the EIM design, and enhancements to it should really be prioritized in the context of what we're doing because it is that foundational to the way the market operates, its ability to incent forward procurement, and its ability to accurately reflect the operational capability of the units at hand. So I wanted to stop there and open it up for the next panel. So I believe, Partha, that is you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Partha, I know you have more color to add to the problem definition, some nuance. So why don't you take us through that sort of as quickly as you can so we can come to more of a dialogue about the tests and the next steps.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Tani. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this today. As a disclaimer, I just want to reflect that the views that I'm expressing here are on my own and do not necessarily reflect the positions of PG&E. Also, to set expectations, I really have a lot of questions on this topic and a few answers for specific solutions I'm advocating for. And so I'm really looking forward to this dialogue to try to understand and scope the issue more. I thought I'd kick it off with a little bit of a discussion to add on to Mark in terms of what's the purpose of the resource efficiency test and how it might fit into the broader goals of a regional market. I hope everyone here has seen the benefits of the EIM to date and the efforts to improve coordination and sharing of resources in the West to achieve a more efficient and reliable grid. I also really appreciate the engagement of folks in the EIM on future efforts to grow these processes, be it in an the EDAM context or in a full RTO, to leverage the diversity of benefits throughout the West. And that really brings us to the topic at hand in terms of, so how do the resource efficiency test and consequences factor in, and how should it work going forward? If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. No, one more. So to add to what Mark discussed, a little bit of history in terms of the policy debates that were developed during the EIM formation circa 2013 and 2014. The EIM was, was a call for comparable treatment between participants and protections against BAAs leaning on the capacity of other neighboring systems. And this led the Kaiso to develop this set of rules for the sufficiency test. I have a few of them listed on the slides. I'm not going to go through them, but I think Mark did a good job capturing what those are. One thing I would note in terms of one of Mark's earlier statements in terms of the incentive for forward procurement, FERC specifically found as a part of the rules that that each BAA's native resource adequacy programs and obligations to comply with NERC standards should provide an adequate resource efficiency framework for the EIM. And so there really is, to me, some question in terms of, is this really the primary driver of what the sufficiency test is trying to do? So the EIM obviously has been in place for many years now, and there's been a lot of experience gained in modification to the rules to address errors in the resource sufficiency test in both directions. And I certainly appreciate what Mark brought to the table in terms of how it's working to date and some of the observations that he's seen. In terms of scoping the problems and solutions, as Mark alluded to, I really would point folks to the Market Surveillance Committee's write-up on the Kaiso summer assessment. The MSC identifies a number of issues, both with the accuracy of the test. Some of these issues result in both directions, for lack of a better term. Some could result in errors where balancing areas were inappropriately cut off, and others could result in errors where the BA was inappropriately not cut off in terms of how the market is currently structured. Another key takeaway from the MSC report is that these risks are really complex. There's a lot of integrated features with how the markets run that we're really trying to solve simultaneously. But that kind of brought me really to, by flipping to the next slide, to like the fundamental question on, why do we have a sufficiency test in the first place? Including what are the negative consequences of failing someone that should have passed the test and passing someone that should have failed the test? And really, are there opportunities that we can do better in terms of how this test is structured in the future to increase the efficiency gains and improve the reliability of the grid through this process? One of the questions Lisa has come up is sort of the concept of leaning, and the concept of leaning has sort of come up across a lot. And really, like I was trying to basically look back through and try to understand more of what are different perspectives in terms of what's wrong with leaning. Originally, when this test was being discussed, such a test to me seemed reasonable was that I thought that there was a reliability risk that one BAA could show up with a deficiency and cause a different BAA to have some sort of near-term reliability consequence. And so this test needed to be designed to prevent that outcome from happening. But the more I hear about people's concerns, the more I think that for many entities, it seems more of an economic issue more than a reliability issue, and or an issue in terms of how do we change the RA incentives or the market incentives in the different states. Which really makes me wonder if there are certain times that where leaning could be allowed more, or in certain instances where leaning should really be prevented in order to address reliability concerns in the neighboring BAAs. Again, listed on this slide is really sort of a list of sort of questions that we had. No answers, lots of questions in terms of how we could reframe the discussion of the RS test, both for the current EIM and for a future expanded structure. And so the first one listed here is, sort of more broadly, can the RS test, be more of an incentive structure instead of being a penalty to get more capacity available in the market? Are there ways to have better sharing of resources for a more efficient dispatch and reduce reserve needs? The second one was more of a question in terms of the potential interaction with different resource adequacy frameworks that are being developed in the West. And certainly as the EIM regions continue to develop their own RA-type framework, there's some question of going forward of, is there a way to marry this in a more of a forward timeline? The third one listed here is questions about voluntary participation in terms of what are the implications of the EIM participants being voluntary versus a longer-term commitment. At least the way I was seeing it was that today, at least, EIM participating resources have a great deal of flexibility in determining how much of its resource capacity is willing to offer to the EIM. So in that context, what are the implications of leaning when any EIM seller can choose not to offer its energy and control the amount that's leaned upon in its market? The last topic, at least, that I was going to bring up, this is really maybe touching more on the issue that Mark was discussed, was in terms of the operational implications of what the impacts might be if a BA is cut off from the EIM just during a system emergency. And at least maybe I'll add on a little bit to Mark's description of the events from this summer. But I think it was a little more complicated in terms of the moving pieces that were happening on those days. Would you mind actually to flip back to slide 3 from Mark's presentation? So at least one of the issues that the Kaiso identified coming out to the summer assessment was that there was a implementation error in its residual unit commitment process coming out of the day-ahead market. So allowed exports to flow, including exports supported by internal Kaiso RA resources, even when the Kaiso BAA was deficient in the day-ahead and RUC process. The DMM has some good analysis on this, and they point out as a part of their assessment that on these 2 days, the 14th and 15th that Mark's discussing, there really was virtual supply bids that were cleared in the day-ahead market, and they were supporting additional export schedules day ahead from the Kaiso market, where about 2,900 megawatts of exports were being scheduled out of Kaiso on the interties, connecting the Kaiso with the adjacent balancing areas, particularly in the Southwest. At least I'd encourage, too, that the DM report is really good. And if you have the opportunity to read it, I'd encourage folks to do so. The DM report went on to note that during these peak needs, as is described in these slides, they said that they can average, as Mark's slides are showing, 1,500 megawatts were coming back in via the EIM on August 14th, and 500 to 550 were able to come in back to the ISO from. And these transfers, at least one of the key things I would note is that these transfers that the DMM were found were almost all coming from the Southwest. And so, to some degree, with the way that DMM was describing is really that it was re-importing the exports that happened and were not recalled from those balancing areas. And this non-recallability, I think, is kind of another key question we have from an operational standpoint. The California Joint Agency report that followed the August events noted that Kaiso chose not to curtail these day-ahead exports in real time, and they gave a variety of reasons, primarily related to BA to BA coordination and the potential impact on neighboring areas. And aligned with that, the DMM, one of their key recommendations was to re-examine these rules and processes for curtailing exports and working with neighboring BAAs to make sure that these rules are well understood and aligned. So one of the questions I have, for example, is, so the Kaiso made the conscious decision not to curtail these day-ahead exports. And so what would happen, for example, if another BAA made a different choice and chose to curtail the exports once they failed this test? Could there be an operational risk placed on the remaining EIM participants? And how would these all pieces fit together during a system emergency? So thanks for the chance to open it up. Those are my questions, and I look forward to other people coming up with solutions because these are really hard topics. So, thank you again, Commissioner Tani. I really appreciate your leadership and for the RIF for organizing this panel.
Absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen, for the setup. And I hear the difference in perspectives on the problem diagnosis. And I think that presents some of the challenge we're going to face around designing solutions, and that solutions are likely to be multifaceted. I don't want to underestimate the complexity of the markets. I want to turn to the specific tests and some of the perspectives. I want to bring in Bobby and Clay, and we can take down the slides, and we're going to have more of a round robin, so if folks want to switch to gallery view in WebEx, you can see the speakers. Feel free. I think there'll be some directions in the chat if you're having trouble doing that. But Bobby, I wonder if you could share some of your perspective on the tests that Mark outlined and your thoughts on how those might need to evolve. And I want to recognize that we end at 2:15 and we've got a lot to cover, so let's have this be a little more conversational, and let's keep have more dialogue back and forth now that we're done with the slides.
Sounds great, Lisa. Thank you very much. I think when it comes to the resource efficiency test, the kind of areas that SRP, and when we look at it, a lot of it has to deal with, can we accommodate the imports or the exports that are kind of being handled there? And so we see working through these sufficiency tests is kind of definitional to say, are we prepared and have we sufficiently committed and planned to participate in EIM? So when we get in flexibility test, it's making sure that SRP has positioned our system, planned it both from a day ahead perspective and then coming up to the hour of operation to make sure that we are able to move our resources around to accommodate either imports or exports. And that's where the flex and both the capacity bid range are critically important to ensure that that we can adequately participate and know that if something were to happen with respect to passing that we ourselves are able to recover from any type of event with respect to EIM. Ultimately, if we look at it as if the transfers went away, are we still able to kind of meet our system load within a given time period? And that's the foundational aspect of how we view and attempt to kind of participate and work through that. When we look at last summer's events, it's, I think I would acknowledge Partha's comments in the sense that if we look at the 14th and 15th, we were seeing exports into the desert Southwest, but we were also looking at how that played into our fundamental requirements with respect to passing those particular tests. That was part of our capacity test, but it wasn't necessarily part of the flexibility test. It's not represented in bid range or flexibility because those become firm put purchases. And so that's one of the things that I think is important when it comes to the test is recognizing that as we set it on a day-ahead basis, we're trying to carry that all the way through into that real-time environment to make sure that we can continue to participate.
Thanks for that. Clay, your perspectives on the tests and challenges there?
Great. Thanks, Commissioner Tani, and I really appreciate the comments of the other presenters. It's I think, been a really good setup. I really appreciated the slides that Mark and Partha put together because I think they really tee up the issue. We have had some concerns about the resource efficiency test for a while, and we see the resource efficiency test as a backstop to the local resource adequacy programs that are in place. And so in a year of pandemics, perhaps it's best to describe the resource adequacy requirements that are set by local and state regulators as measures to prevent infection in a balancing authority, and then the resource sufficiency tests really act like an effort to stop contagion, so going beyond the bounds of your BA. But we also feel like we have concerns that once an entity fails a resource sufficiency test, that they may be cut off from the energy imbalance market. Is that the correct approach, or are there alternative approaches which may allow for some leaning if, for example, the neighboring BAs have adequate generation available, but perhaps it's appropriate that a different price structure be in place to compensate for that additional generation which is on standby and may only be called on once or twice a year. And so we feel like we recognize that not everybody just thinks of a resource efficiency failure as being cut off from the energy imbalance market. However, I think if you're in the repo market and you're trading commercial paper and the repo market cuts you off and won't allow you to trade anymore, you feel like you're excluded from the market even if your existing transactions are allowed to stand. And so if the EIM prevents you from trading even one more megawatt, we have concerns with that maybe that's not the appropriate outcome under all conditions. And we saw that, or we raised that, I think it was we saw that with NV Energy in 2017 when it looked like they were being cut off from the market at really a time when a regional market could have come to their aid and assisted them. And we also feel like when we look at these regional markets and we do these studies, it's never contemplated that a BA would be cut off from the rest of the regional market during a situation like this. And so we are losing some of the value of a regional market when we do exclude an entity for having failed a resource efficiency test. However, it's also important that we prevent this contagion aspect from propagating across the region. The other point that I would like to make, and I think was both Partha and Mark highlighted, was really the deliverability test, or the deliverability concern. There is the transmission feasibility test, the power flow feasibility test. It has a million names, but it's non-binding. We raised this issue in the December 2019 EIM Regional Issues Forum, that we have concerns that we called it infeasible base schedules are allowed to stand, and that these base schedules may not be deliverable, but they're being included in these tests. And we have concerns about that for several reasons. One is that it can inflate the neutrality cost, but in addition, it can make a BA look or appear to be resource sufficient even while it is definitely resource insufficient. And you can see that when you have in the slide that Mark showed that you have an EEA3 event going on, but you're passing resource sufficiency tests. It may be that the resources that are allowing you to pass the resource sufficiency tests are on the wrong side of a transmission constraint. And the concern there is that now the resources that can be deliverable or are deliverable are being undervalued, and the transmission that is required to make those resources deliverable is not being properly valued. And so we have some concerns with the deliverability. And then maybe I'll just pause there and we can come back if there are any additional questions.
Thanks. Mark and Partha, you both raised specifics. I think, Mark, in particular, your slide laying out the different elements around the different tests and how they might need to evolve. Does the evaluation of the tests need to be, strip it all the way back and put everything in scope to evaluate, or are there some really key pieces here that you think are no-brainers and need to be reevaluated? I hear Clay raising one around the transmission and deliverability, but I wonder, both of you put forward really broad sets of questions. Is that where we need to start? Is that unpacking of the tests fundamentally, or is there some easy, yes, this has to be fixed first?
I think the short answer, if I may, is we don't really know. Mm-hmm. I think it's both we, and this was part of the MSC's opinion as well, we're speculating on what we think some of the deficiencies in the test may be. We have reason to believe what we're identifying on the slides, but to your point at the very outset of this discussion, it'd be really helpful to, further the confidence level in the test by walking through that crosswalk and having a discussion about, A, is there a problem with that particular element? B, if there is a problem, is it more of a software bug, as the MSC opinion characterized some of the potential? Or is it a more fundamental discussion that needs to be had around, is this about leaning? Do we need to have a discussion about whether this is an appropriate behavior before we can decide how to articulate that in a test construct like this? And then finally, the last part gets to the consequences of what we want to do about it. I don't think, definitely speaking for Bonneville, but also the other participants, nobody wants to have this test put anybody into a reliability bind or cause anyone to have to shed load. That's just the reality of where we're at. The question then becomes, how can we use these market frameworks to further instill both confidence, but also understanding that we are prepared from a reliability perspective and also prepared from an equity perspective, right? That, there's a fair way that everybody's coming to the table, the proverbial potluck example, prepared to have that meal, and the qualities of resources or the amounts of resources are equitably distributed. So I think that's the key point, is we want to understand more and really engage in this discussion before we can make a conclusion about exactly what needs to be done going forward.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to remedies, but Partha, any thoughts on that question? It sounded like you were coming to the table with more questions than answers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Mark is certainly right in terms of, we lean heavily in terms of the Kaiso's analysis and the MSC's analysis in terms of what the scope of those problems are. Maybe one, at least I'd sort of highlight from the MSC report was, they highlighted an issue with sort of false positives with the case of the test, just in terms of how the current Kaiso's hourly block airtight import bids might interact with the EIM bids in the sufficiency test. And at least if I were to describe it, how that is, and I think the MSC had indicated that they discussed it with the Kaiso as well, is that when the Kaiso is looking for hourly block imports and looking at whether or not to dispatch them or not, they will basically judge the economics of those hourly block imports versus potential EIM transfers and bids in the market as well. And so it might be the case where they don't accept those hourly block bids because it looks like there's cheaper EIM resources available, but there might be an interaction where once they don't accept that hourly block bid, now we might actually fail the EIM sufficiency test. So that was at least one area that I was hoping to learn more about in the Kaiso stakeholder process of how much a risk was that, were there solutions that we could work on if it was a large risk. So, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Let's turn a bit to, you've all touched on it some, but this question of remedies, right? What's the appropriate step when an entity fails? And I hear you on the, because a regulator wouldn't want somebody pushed into a reliability event either, but what's the level of incentive that's necessary? And Clay, I'd like to start with you because I think when we were preparing for this, you were raising some interesting points around transparency, and incentives don't work if parties can't see enough in the market to make a rational choice or anticipate other folks' rational choices. So why don't you explore that, and then we'll have a more conversation about the remedies.
Sure, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity. So a couple of the items that we had highlighted in 2019 was that we felt like having the results of the resource sufficiency tests publicly available for all of the binding intervals would be important and critical for the market to understand how they are, how adequate they really are. And one of the tests that we want, of course, is the transmission feasibility or the power flow feasibility test. It's not currently binding, but we feel like the market outcomes are being influenced or are contingent upon that test result. We also asked for transparency on the uplift charges that result that are passed on to the energy to the EIM entities. And the reason why is that some of the neutrality charges that are passed along are indicative of maybe failure of deliverability with some of the resources. So congestion offsets, we feel like, is a signature neutrality charge that you see a lot when there's a lot of undeliverability, or what we have been calling or had been calling infeasible, but I think is simply as because of the feasibility test, we call them infeasible, but maybe deliverability is a more popular term at this point.
Great. Others want to add their perspective on remedies. I'm hearing a fair amount of consensus about not just cutting people off, but then how do we take the next step? What is the right remedy?
I think this is Bobby. It's hard to know exactly what the right remedy is. I mean, SRP shares the same perspective as others on here in terms of not wanting to put others into a reliability event. I think it is worth noting that last summer provided an opportunity to kind of explore the opposite. When someone goes into a reliability event, how did that affect others depending upon them for transfers? And I think that's something that we need to get to from a remedy perspective, because I do believe some entities, despite being in emergency status, were still exporting under EIM. And I think there's a lot of questions that come about from that. Trying to remedy it, I think, openly, I like the concept of what Partha is kind of asking to is there an opportunity to provide kind of more of a carrot than a stick? I think conceptually, a lot of people would be interested in carrots and incentives that drive in that particular, in a direction that incents the behavior that we want. The question ultimately really gets to how do you ensure that that's equitable and fair across all entities participating with the EIM? Because I think that's one of the challenges we see now is not everyone is subject to the same rules and same requirements. And speaking to the concept that Kaiso doesn't necessarily have to follow through on some of the same obligations of the test. And I think that transparency, publishing those results and making sure that we have opportunities to kind of explore it openly, and timing of when that information is available is certainly something to explore. But that's something that I think is critically important to provide confidence as well as support for that carrot approach, as if we can see exactly how it works through that.
Mm-hmm. Mark and Partha, thoughts? I heard Partha, you raising sort of the perspective that the NERC standards, quoting the FERC order around the NERC standards, and I wonder, how do you draw that forward? What does that mean for today?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and maybe we should touch on a little bit of what Bobby was saying, and sort of the questions that we have around the sufficiency test is that, and I can't speak for the Kaiso, but as our BAA, but my guess is, if the shoe on the other foot, it doesn't matter if we officially cut off transfers, that in basically the practice, the NERC standards of supporting your neighboring balancing areas, to agree that Kaiso had extra energy and was, and could support the neighboring areas if they were having a system emergency. Those practices, they would send the power there. And so to some degree, it's really a question of what is this doing from a functional standpoint. And my own take is that if you're really going to have a impact on this, is you really probably have to move this to more of a forward timeline in terms of what the showings look like and what the remedies are. And that having this be operationalized in that 15-minute market and cutting folks off, to Mark's point, if this really is sort of a matter of providing incentives to the RA paradigm or providing sort of a more forward incentive, probably having a test and sort of carrots on that more forward timeline, it probably is sort of the more effective way to actually achieve both those goals and the operational efficiencies / reliability that we're all trying to achieve. So,
so more forward-looking as opposed to sticks after the fact fines or true-up prices or something after the fact. Mark, any thoughts on the remedies issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two key things to keep in mind here. One is there are a set of incentives that exist, and frankly, those incentives are the prices in the market that encourage the participation of resources that are there. That is, one meaningful incentive. And so, having those prices as best they can accurately reflect the conditions on the grid helps incent that participation and provides the resources, provides resources with capability to be able to address some of these reliability challenges. Now, the second piece, as you try to marry up more of a forward showing for like RA versus, a more real-time resource efficiency is, RA programs by their very nature are more planning-centric, right, and have to use forecasts in that time frame. And really, what we're getting to by having it be this close to the operational horizon, T-75 down to T-40, is we really get the benefit of having as good an understanding as we can operationally achieve of the uncertainty that has to be managed through the market and the resources that are available at the time. And so that's really when you can capture that maximum amount of diversity. If you happen to know that there's, corresponding impacts from solar and wind happening on different parts of the grid, for example, you might not need to respond for both of those things as an individual balancing authority operating separately. They both need to respond in their own way. And so I think that's really part of what we want to be able to achieve here is make sure that while it's still close enough to the operating horizon that we can really address those key areas of uncertainty and the diversity that comes with it. And then I guess just lastly to kind of close on the fact that, I think our perspective is that we want to have the consequences of the test really mirror as close possible the types of actions that operators would be taking anyway. Operators take proactive moves that are graduated in fashion in order to address the challenges that they see coming in front of them. And, that's really the kind of thing that we want to see coming out of these tests as well, is to encourage that type of proactive and graduated behavior, so that, as Bobby articulated, the balancing authorities and the participants are prepared for the environments that they're going to be facing within the operating hours.
Thanks. Let's turn with just our last few minutes before we come to the end of the panel. What does this mean going forward? So there's a conversation to have around the EIM. I think there's some movement, some growing momentum towards what comes after the current decisions that will go before the governing body tomorrow, for example. But when you look out over the horizon towards EDAM and so on, what are the implications? What should we take away from this work to unpack this issue for working more closely together or being yet more integrated because of the economic benefit that we potentially see for customers?
Commissioner Connie, this is Clay. Maybe one thing I will just mention is that right now in the EIM, one of the concerns is that if you fail the resource efficiency tests, you are cut off. I know some will disagree with that comment, but you are effectively cut off from buying incremental power from the market. And the only way that a neighboring VA can come to your assistance is to work around the market. And the market is a little bit of an obstruction to assisting a neighboring VA in that scenario. And so as we look forward to something like EDAM, I think it's important that as we consider that we are integrated, that we use market solutions instead of binary solutions or these blunt tools like cutting an entity off from the market, and try to work collaboratively together, because each region does have different resources and portfolios that can be valuable in some of these extreme scenarios. And so as we consider EDAM, as we consider any additional market enhancements, that's certainly something that we should consider, is that the market should not become an obstruction to assisting a neighboring VA.
So what I'm hearing from you is that as a regulator, I need to be careful about falling into sort of a binary, no leaning is the ideal. I'm willing to give up the economics because it's actually more nuanced and complicated. That sometimes, in fact, I may want to or need some leaning, but it's how the remedies work so that that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Other folks, other thoughts?
I think the key piece for that is goes exactly back to the equity, right? So the goal of a day-ahead market is really a bit different than the goal of a real-time market. The goal of a day-ahead market can really get at efficiencies in the unit commitment horizon, and I think that's where there needs to be some conversation. And I think, frankly, this is why Parth is raising the point about the timing of the resource sufficiency test is, how do you balance those unit commitment decisions in the context of a real-time market? But the reality is many of those unit commitment decisions are made significantly further away from the operating hour, primarily in the day ahead. And there's an opportunity there to gain a lot more efficiency there and possibly get a more effective dispatch as well. So how do you accomplish that in the day ahead time frame and have a similar type resource sufficiency test that, still will not obviate the need for a resource sufficiency test in the real time to make sure that as you continue to waterfall your way into that operational horizon, that the resources are still operationally capable to meet the demands that are placed on the system.
I tend to agree with Mark. One of the challenges that I think that we'll need to keep in mind as we start looking towards an EDAM and thinking something along kind of a day-ahead market is really, especially if we combine that with the risk of kind of a tighter and tighter capacity supply here in the West, I think we really need to start thinking about the concept of how can a day-ahead environment be constructed from a reliability basis to ensure that we have physical deliverability and that we can maintain that for all participants all the way through that real-time environment. The temptation will be to pursue every last ounce of every last penny we can squeeze out of a day-ahead market. And the reality is, as we look at what has happened with resource adequacy, with ERCOT may be a good example. Don't want to draw conclusions too soon on that, but it's the reality that as we start pursuing the absolute lowest cost, there starts to become a point where there is an inflection against reliability. And if we start with the focus on reliability and building a market around that, it may not squeeze every last penny out, but we will clearly all benefit both from a reliability and capacity perspective. And if that serves as a guiding light for foundational principles for market design, we can ensure that it's equitable and maintain that going forward.
So, Bobby, that feels relatively different from the way we talk about the EDAM as an economic advantage. And the sort of perception I think that, at least that I have as a regulator, that reliability is the responsibility exclusively of the BA, and I'm not going to look to the market for that. I hear you saying sort of, what if we set out that reliability requirement or reliability opportunity in the design of the market more centered, in a more centered way, that we might get both the economics and the reliability as opposed to bifurcating it as intensely as we have in EIM. Am I hearing you, or am I overdrawing stronger conclusions?
I think maybe it's a little bit stronger conclusions. I'm not advocating for turning over kind of individual BA responsibilities at this point in time, but I think reliability has to be kind of centric at the foundation of the start there. And the basis for it is if you're really going to try and get participation, voluntary participation, and kind of that trust and faith that we can work through it collaboratively, we've got to know that as we turn our units over for kind of collective commitment as an entity block, that there is inherently some form of trust that is being placed in kind of that recollection, that everybody is going to have sufficient resources and that it's going to maintain itself across the entire footprint as much as we can through that operating environment. And it's that trust of how much do I turn over and participate on a voluntary aspect. That's really kind of the crux of that reliability question. If I can't do so in a manner that I'm confident that everyone has the same invested interest and has the same potential consequences of outcome for failure, I think that's where we need to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Partha, your thoughts on this?
Sure. I really support the comments made, particularly by Clay, Mark, and Bobby. I think that those are good questions and good topics to think about. And one thing that we've sort of wrestled with was sort of the what does it mean, like at least in terms of the next steps for market progression, is sort of what does it mean for this market to be voluntary, and in what timelines? And so to some degree, we could imagine a concept where the next stage involved an EDAM type structure, but it had participation that looked like monthly commitments for transmission and generation. If such a structure were to arise, it would be very different sort of corresponding changes to a resource efficiency test and sort of a timeline that allowed solutions to be, maybe possibly internal to the market, possibly external, to sort of correct those deficiencies in a timely manner. So I think that that's sort of at least something that we're thinking about is sort of what's that scope of the future market, and how can we evolve these, we'll say, resource efficiency resource adequacy rules, depending on sort of the level of commitment and the timing of commitment for future participation.
Thanks. Clay, you look like you want to add something.
Thanks. Yeah, I do. You know, as we consider these regional markets and the tests like the resource efficiency tests that exist for the energy imbalance market, regionally, all of the BAs are becoming more tightly coupled because the BAs are now going to aspire to satisfy the resource efficiency tests as they are defined. And so making sure that those resource efficiency tests are adequate and that they are measuring the things that they are intended to measure becomes much more critical because each BA or all of the BAs in the West are becoming much more tightly coupled. And so if you have a resource efficiency test that are failing us or are not adequately measuring resource efficiency, we could be creating a systemic risk and creating blind spots for us as a region that may result in unreliability. It's the equivalent of having the ninja loan in our energy industry if we are not adequately checking to make sure that people are resource efficient.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I think we're coming to about 5 or 7 minutes before the end of our panel. I'd love to do a round robin and see what you want to leave the RIF audience with, the governing body members that have joined us, and what are sort of your parting thoughts as we think about the Kaiso grapples with what's the next step? Maybe let's start with Mark and work our way through again.
You bet. So thanks for that. Appreciate it. And thanks again for having this panel today and Bobby and Clay and Partha for their participation as well. So, you know, I would just harken back to some of the opening slides, particularly that last one, where, you know, you heard me answer the question with, we don't know. And that's really a key point from our perspective. We want to be able to have an accurate test that's equitably applied and maintain that level of transparency and confidence that both you and Clay have referred to. Those things are going to be foundational to the success of EIM, and the success of EIM is foundational to the success of any future market endeavor that we want to achieve. So that's the key item that I would leave folks with here this morning or this afternoon.
Thanks. Partha, your thoughts?
Sure. I probably sort of focus in on the point of, I think there's a lot of discussions which are divided sort of two areas. One is sort of how do we sort of divide the current pie of benefits? And like at least what I'd encourage sort of in the next phase is really how do we increase the size of the pie? And how do we have a structure that really increases the overall benefits to everyone? Because it is a much easier discussion in terms of how do we make sure that everyone benefits from this EIM, EDAM, whatever the next phase is going forward. Because to me, like there's big challenges associated with meeting our various states' GHG and clean energy goals, and that this cooperation really is key. So, yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks. Clay, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And once again, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the panelists as well and their comments. Very well thought out. We would like to renew our call for the making mandatory or binding the transmission feasibility test. We think that that is an essential test because you can have resources within a BA that have bid range capacity, they have base schedules that allow an entity to show that they're balanced, and yet not be able to make it to load. And so we feel like the deliverability or the transmission feasibility test is essential, and that's as close as we can get right now. And I think that's an easy fix by changing it from simply optional or non-binding to making it a mandatory test or a binding test for resource efficiency. I think that starts to expose where we have deliverability problems. The second item that I will also reiterate is that we think that the results of these sufficiency tests should be transparent and publicly available so that we can see them. I think that's an additional remedy on a going forward basis that's very easy. It doesn't require significant effort to expose the results of those tests. And then one that is a little bit more complicated and would take some time to roll out and wouldn't be available for the summer, but certainly should be contemplated on a going forward basis, is whether or not it makes sense to cut off a VA once they fail these tests, or maybe there's a different or a better result that we can get to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Bobby's disappeared, but I'm going to just put a call out in case he's still on the line.
I am still on the line, Commissioner Connie. I apologize. I don't know why I'm having some technical difficulties here with video, but I would echo the appreciation to the panelists as well as to you, Commissioner Tani, for kind of facilitating this discussion. I think from a closing perspective, from what I would like to leave is, Mark characterized it on one of his slides, but I do think that it's really important is that when we think about the resource efficiency test and kind of what persists moving forward, I think we should all be advocating and looking for a series of tests that we all have confidence that reflects the accuracy of the test and it reflects what we believe is most likely to occur before EIM starts flowing one way or the other. We need to make sure that it's effective for everybody and that there's buy-in from all of the participants and belief that it is effective in measuring what the real capabilities of everyone's systems are. And then when it comes to the last one, it does need to continue to be equitable, and we need to make sure that it maintains equitability across the entire footprint for everyone who participates. And then when we get to consequences of failure, we do think that we need to be mindful about how consequences are implemented in order not to create or exacerbate reliability problems as we roll through it. So that's probably where I would leave my comments, if that works for you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that all four of you brought to the conversation and unpacking such a complicated set of issues. I hear that we have a lot of work ahead of us in analysis, understanding the issue, really peeling apart how we're getting the behavior, and then some really honest conversations about what the right next steps might be, especially as we are more and more tightly connected. I think even if we weren't in a market, we would be struggling with how to make sure we were resource adequate across the whole region and not leaning on each other. It's just, I think, the market makes it more apparent that that's what the future holds. Likely it held it anyway, regardless of whether we were in a market or not. We just probably wouldn't have seen it quite as transparently. But I appreciate so much your time. And Pam, I'm going to hand it back to you. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for facilitating such a wonderful panel. I will note that in terms of our regularly scheduled RIF programming, this is one of the highest levels of attendance that we've ever seen in one of our virtual RIFs. We have over 125 people on today. So that's, I think, a clear indication about the relevancy and the timeliness of this topic. And I appreciate everyone's willingness to have a candid conversation today. It's clear that there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and I hope that all of you continue to do your outreach to Kaiso and to the governing body to ensure that we continue to address the issues identified today and into the future. And with that, I will turn it over to our next panel. Our next panel is going to look at the Kaiso's forecasting methodology. And Amber Motley is the manager of that group, and Michael Stewart is, I think, also going to co-present with her today. And so, Amber and Michael, if you're ready, I will hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having us here at the RIF. We always like to come and talk to you guys about forecasting. We like to talk about forecasting all the time, of course. Whether that be the storms, and we might actually get hail in California today, or whatever is going on throughout the whole Western interconnect. So I appreciate coming to the RIF and talking about it. So Michael's going to walk through a presentation about the forecasting services that the ISO has, some of the details of our load model, what we have within the renewable forecasting space, diving into persistence, which I know many of you guys are interested in. But really, we wanted to make sure we left time for any questions that you had to have more of a dialogue with this group as well. So I will pass it to Michael to go through some of the different services and different model makeups within the forecasting for load and renewables. But we'll have time at the end for question and answers. I really want to hear from you guys and are willing to talk about any intricacies within our forecasting process. So, Michael?
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Stewart. As Amber mentioned, I am on the short-term forecasting team. And today I'll be going through some information on the load forecast as well as renewable forecast too. So, as mentioned, my name is Michael. So as mentioned, I was going to review the load forecasting as well as the renewable forecasting that the short-term forecasting, kind of how we go about our process and what we offer in that space. And there's also an additional bullet under renewable forecasting for the persistence methodology in the RTD market. But I can certainly review more of that when we get there. So next slide, please. So the short-term forecast looks, it's defined by, it can be anywhere between the next 5 minutes. It can go upwards to 2 weeks out. It's very important to a lot of the processes that go on in terms of reliability and what takes place in the market. From reliability, there are day-ahead studies conducted, and for the real-time and day-ahead market, there are essential functions that are dependent on the load forecast, such as the unit commitment, things like economic dispatch, the determination of whether or not generators can go on maintenance. For example, if forecast is very high, perhaps probably not the move to have those units on maintenance, and you need those to show up when the time is needed. So, very important piece of what the Kaiso does. So next slide, please. So the load forecast is can be linear or nonlinear depending on the model configuration. We have many models for the many regions that we are responsible for, but the load forecast derives most of its impact from a few key areas. One of those is the weather conditions. Another one is the socioeconomic landscape. So, for example, this last year, the COVID-19 space that we have all been in has been very impactful across much of the world, actually, in terms of how people use their electrical consumption in the space that we're currently in. The previous system load plays a very critical role as well. And then new technologies that haven't been as impactful, but have done so over the past year, or over the past years. An example of that would be rooftop solar penetration and its impact that it has on the grid. Another one of those that has been emerging is the installation of batteries on the grid as well. And in terms of the weather, again, very, very large driver. The most critical variables that go into the load forecast and can end up swinging it, but impacting the direction that it goes would be things like temperature, the humidity, and cloud cover. So there are other variables that we do consider, but those three generally are the heaviest, just considering the relationship that those have in terms of how people use electronic or electrical consumption. Next slide, please. So when developing a load forecast, the forecasting team, as mentioned previously, we do choose the weather location very carefully. Oftentimes we use a number of weather stations. It ultimately just depends on the region. If it's very expansive or if it sits on the border of a different climatological landscape, that's going to play a pretty big role in things. The historical load is very important. The load shape can change from March. The load shape in March is much different than the load shape in, say, August, for example. And we like to have a large data set so that the model can, key on what month it is, what day of the week it might be. Your weekend consumption is also different. But also having those holidays in there as well. Especially those moving holidays throughout the week. For example, July 4th is not always on a particular day. It can be on a weekend or it can be, in the middle of the week. So giving the load model plenty of information to work with kind of sets it up for a little bit more success, if you will, in terms of trying to figure out where it needs to go in a particular situation. And then another thing that we are very careful to get is any sort of load reduction information. As mentioned previously, things like behind-the-meter solar, or any sort of demand response program, and if there's any kind of battery behavior as well as pump storage behavior. So getting all of these is very critical when we go to begin working on the entity's load model. And it's very important that we have the best information possible because, that's what's going to end up getting an accurate forecast. And something else that is crucial is having kind of like your previous data be aligned with your current data or data moving forward. So, for example, if the temperature station, the forecasted temperatures for a particular station need to match and be pretty accurate with respect to how that station has recorded weather information over the years that is ultimately feeding into ELS, the load forecast system, and feeding the load model to send out to the market. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, there are several different, this is kind of a neat slide here. So we can start on the left. So as mentioned, there are several inputs that go into the load forecast. We have a behind-the-meter data provider that gives us estimates for the behind-the-meter forecast for particular regions. We work very closely with them to dial down that prediction. We have two weather providers that we can select to feed those load forecast model, and we also have an on-site meteorologist review at the weather setup and determine one, where the risk is, and two, where the weather vendor or which weather vendor would be most accurate in that sense. Or in certain cases, she's actually done adjustments to feed into the load models, and then that is then used from there. And so all this information gives way to the day-ahead forecast and the real-time forecast. And as mentioned previously, both the forecast has a lot of critical use in how the reliability is managed and how the market is run. So that the day-ahead forecast goes out 9 days, and it's updated every day at 9 o'clock. And the real-time forecast is a rolling 24 hours, and it's at 5-minute granularity, and that updates every minute. So there's a lot of data being generated, a lot of data coming into ALS and being considered and the forecasting team keeps tabs on all of these pieces of data to determine what is going to yield the most accurate forecast to help the market optimize as best as it can. So, for example, we have the ability to select the active forecast provider. As it's mentioned again, the on-site meteorologist does have the ability to, choose which forecast provider is best, or she can also go in and make those adjustments herself, and we track all of that stuff as well. That the day-ahead forecast, it says hourly here. It's kind of interchangeable, I guess, if you will. But that is used, as mentioned previously, in reliability studies, any sort, determining outages. The real-time forecast is more for optimization, unit commitment, prices, things like that. So that's how the Kaiso system uses the forecast that its forecasting team generates and watches very closely. And an additional thing that we do is provide internal confidence scans to provide to operations to give them assistance on where we think the risk might be. So, an example for this time of year comes with, because it is cloudy outside, there can be some uncertainty when it comes to the rooftop solar impact because the penetration is so deep here in California. So that is something else that we provide as well. So, next slide, please. So this slide kind of gets at the models within the model, if you will. So previously I mentioned there was a real-time forecast and a day-ahead forecast. You can kind of think of the real-time forecast being this sort of persistence model that is within the model. So I can kind of go through that. So that persistence model is looking backwards at the previous actuals, anywhere from 0 to 75 minutes back, and that's completely configurable by the forecasting team. As mentioned, we do have several models for each region, and that is something that we tweak, and we by studying the region's load, maybe we start with 60 minutes of previous actuals, maybe we find that 15 minutes is best. It's just something, it's a feature that a little lever that we have to utilize to see, does this yield a more accurate forecast. So, and the primary thing that the persistence model is doing in the load forecast is it's forecasting off of those actuals and the day type that we're experiencing that day, and that slowly blends into the hour ahead model, or that's your real-time forecast that's blending to that larger scale day ahead forecast. So for that hour ahead model, again, this is configurable. It's forecasting anywhere from 40 minutes out to 4 hours now. That's also a lever that we have, and that's weighting the weather a little bit more than the persistence model is, but it's also considering where the actuals are as well. So it's kind of like that key transition in between the persistence and day ahead. So the day ahead model is the forecast from 4 hours out to 9 days, again, configurable. And that is keying off of more the weather inputs and the similar days. With a very hot day in March, for example, it's looking back at its historical similar days, and it's using all of its other variables to come up with its calculation to arrive there. So when we kind of sandwich all of these together, you kind of have a blend from persistence model into the hour ahead model and then into the day ahead model as well. And that occurs every 5 minutes with respect to that real-time forecast that's born. So you may not see a whole lot of movement in the day ahead, but it's constantly going. Next slide, please. So here is a figure of the load forecasting accuracy in 2020 at the T60 mark. I don't know if it's cut off there a little bit at the bottom, but the different colors represent the different participants in the EIM. Oh, there it is, actually scrolling. So the different colors represent the different participants in the EIM in 2020. So, and as you can see, there's a bit of increased forecast error, and that is relating to what I was mentioning earlier, when COVID-19 started impacting how people are using their electricity, behaviors were changing, stay at home was in full swing, and we were off trying to fill out the new landscape that we were in. But the forecasting team did work very hard to create new models to try and adjust for that space that we were in, and was able to bring that back down, as you can start to see in May and June. So, next slide, please. Here's a similar slide at T40. Again, the various colors, they match up with the previous slide in terms of market participants. You can kind of see again for March and April, the error rate, increased a bit. It's just, again, due to the different behaviors that we were seeing at places like the ramp rate for the morning turn, the middle of the day. Morning turn was very interesting to see. It was much wider because there was a work from home presence that was much larger, as opposed to wake up, get ready for bed, get ready for work, and then out the door you go. So it's kind of prolonged and widened a little bit. So that was having an impact on the model that was not previously tuned to see something like that. Next slide, please.
Michael, before we jump to the next slide, I just want to make one point on these. One, we are reporting out the T60 accuracy within our bi-monthly MPPS, Market Performance Planning Forum. So if you are looking for these, outside of this presentation in the public forum with all of the entities listed, we're going to add more entities, but it got very, very busy. So all of those are within MPPS presentation for everybody to look at. And then the other thing I always like to mention when we're looking at accuracy of entities compared and kind of aligned like this, when we run accuracy, you're taking the forecasts minus the actual divided by the actual on the system. That's how we run the accuracy metric for load and specific. And note, when you're dividing by Kaiso's load, we're dividing by 25,000. When you're dividing by somebody who's smaller load, that has a big impact on what accuracy number you have. So having everybody right next to each other, we don't always expect them to act the same because overall in the calculation, it's going to be very hard for them to act the same because of the mathematical formula that's behind it. Also, everybody has different characteristics. So the two things that Kaiso, APS, Nevada as well, we have a lot of behind-the-meter penetration on the systems. Pakis does as well. And with that, you see at times, depending on the weather system, Kaiso in specific Q1 is very impacted by behind the meter. So our accuracy is higher within those quarters that we have cloud cover moving through. Some of that happens with the EIM as well. So not everybody is the same. I don't expect ever that we see the same across the board for those two things. We do put this out there so you have visibility to where everybody is within the whole footprint, but I just wanted to put those two things out there as well. And I'll pass it back to Michael.
And just an additional note from what Amber was mentioning, there were, each entity is, a little different. It's just, she was mentioning there's different climates. There's, some are impacted by rain a little bit more. Heavy rain can end up giving different behaviors to the region as well. If there's any sort of variability in the load, that's going to be a little bit different than forecasting an area that doesn't have some of that intra-hour variability as well. So that was a good point. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the previous two slides were measuring the T60 and T40 accuracy. When the forecasting team tracks accuracy, they are tracking the T80, the T60, and the T40 forecast horizons. But in reality, those forecasts are used for the T75 base schedule, and as well as the T55 as well. So, and the reason that we are tracking it this way is because there is some processing time that takes, that occurs when the forecast moves from ALS into the market. And this, by the forecasting team doing this, this allows us to track the accuracy of, as mentioned earlier, there are several models for each region, and this allows us to keep it apples to apples. So when we look at the T80 forecast, that is being used for the T75 minute, balancing tests and things like that. So I just wanted to have this slide here to go over, what that was. If there might be people wondering what T60 was, but we're familiar with what T55 is. That's all that is. Next slide, please. So the EIM options for load forecasting, there are a couple. The EIM entity can use its own load forecast. That is something that's absolutely available to them, and they can, essentially send that to ALS, and that would get passed through into the market. The other option is that the entity can elect to use the Kaiso generated demand forecast, and that is, that uses the same route as described earlier. So an additional thing to that, by electing to use the Kaiso demand forecast that we would generate, the entity is exempt from any sorts of over or under scheduling charges too. So that is also a benefit there. Next slide, please. So future improvements to the load forecasting. We've been in a couple of different forums lately discussing some of these things, and I think this is an additional forum to do so. But, EIM entities do have the option to provide Kaiso their load forecast. It's not so much that, as the previous slide talks about, well, if you use the Kaiso forecast, you get exemptions from the over and under scheduling. If the entity submits a forecast to the Kaiso, we could use that as, for our own internal analysis. And if we find that that forecast is, in fact, more accurate, we will use that to use in the market optimization until, the next analysis that we have, in which case we do the same thing and do that reanalysis on the EIM submitted forecast and against all the various models that we have. So it would just be used as another tool in the shed, and if it proves more accurate, then we would certainly use that, and we would still be exempt from those under and over scheduling charges. So that is something that we encourage and we welcome. We are also working to further coordinate meter validation parameters. As mentioned earlier on in this presentation, good data in equals good data out. And those load actuals that come in are very critical to the real-time forecast. That's another area that we're working on. Other bullet here shows the behind-the-meter solar forecasting. As mentioned, we have a behind-the-meter data feed, and we are working to incorporate that into the EIM load forecasting to help with that behind-the-meter penetration and a good number of you all have. So we are trying to get out in front of that one and improve the accuracy on that front where we can. We also further monitor and make those improvements due to this evolving COVID landscape. There for a while it was changing depending on the state the state policy that was going on, and we were again not only keeping close tabs on the accuracy, but also keeping tabs on what we might need to expect to anticipate what might then start occurring in the next week and things like that. So because it's evolving and hopefully slowly coming out of this, that's another thing that we are doing there as well. And finally, we are looking to improve the forecast movement between that T80 and T60 forecast update. So we're trying to keep things as stable as possible. That way, there's not a large change of any sort of base scheduling needed in that crucial 20-minute period there. So, we're working to keep things as stable as possible in that window. So that, I believe, is all of what I had down for the load forecasting section. And I'm just going to pause here and see if there are any questions I'd be happy to take and then discuss with you all.
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you could do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad now.
Thank you for that presentation and for the updates that you're giving us. I'll go ahead and maybe ask the first question while folks are getting into the queue. And my question relates to this last bullet here on your future improvements. And I'm curious as how you manage really the transitions between the different tasks that you use and how that could impact the resource efficiency tests and the load forecast associated with those tests, and if there are, if you're monitoring or addressing kind of the smoothing opportunities as you're looking to improve those forecasts.
Right. So that last bullet kind of rolls a couple of these bullets up, actually. So that last bullet really addresses that, that forecast update that occurs every 5 minutes, right? So while we want the forecast to update, as frequently as it can to get the best information possible out there, as quickly as it can. With that, it's kind of like a trade-off, right? It's like, well, we want things stable, but we also need it to update. And so what this is getting at is we're trying to drill down and address some of those areas which would, drive some of that movement. And one of those is goes back to the meter validation point there. So we have been, on the Kaiso side, we regularly, we perform a meter validation check to, we do it by month, per entity to try and, anytime there's a bad telemetry that comes through and gets into ALF, we have a system in place automatically as well as manually to, clean that data and not have that used in the load forecast. But we've also, asked entities themselves, can you please set up those validations on the external side as well to prevent that data from, coming into ALF and, potentially, again, there's only so much that we're able to do in that regard. So that is one way that we are trying to tackle some of that forecast movement, because the forecast movement at that space would be driven by primarily things like the load actuals coming in.
Just
one of the other
on that too, Michael, and I know where you're coming from, Pam. We know and have heard from the EIM entities how sensitive the T80 to T60 movement is. From the forecasting side of things, our goal is accuracy, right? We do know you have the test during that period of time. That's why we analyze those 2 periods of time alongside the 2 tests. But like Michael's saying, one of the things that we've done is we've set metrics up to analyze and track the movement between T80 and T60, the percentage of that movement. That's something that Michael watches and reports out. The other thing is this year we're incorporating what we call jumpiness within the EIM, and which is a little different than movement. Movement is the difference between T80 and T60 forecast. Jumpiness is the movement we have in the forecast for, say, the peak time frame. So one set period of time, and how that one set period of time goes up or down throughout that different piece. So we are watching those carefully. The piece that's difficult from forecasting is not all of them are actuals and how your actuals come in. have a big indicator of how that is, whether it's behind the meter that's driving your actual, whether you have a monsoon coming through that's driving your actual. Some of those things create the movement. So you have to watch it very carefully because we have to balance the reduction of jumpiness or movement and make sure that we still have the best accurate forecast going to the optimization at the same time. But we know, and we've heard from the EIM entities, which is why we wanted to put this bullet on there, and we do have metrics that we've developed that we are watching both the movement and the jumpiness impact on that. But what we see and what we're looking at the most is what is the driver? And is that driver something that we can resolve? And if it's movement in actuals or bad data that came in that drove it, that one's hard for us to resolve. And we have to lean on the EIM entities, what caused the bad data, why all of a sudden do you have a lot of load movement in your telemetry and things like that.
Thank you. Do we have any questions on the line?
I currently have no questions in the queue.
Well, I will maybe ask another question. So I know that there were a lot of challenges when we went into lockdown. The pandemic started, and it really changed, I think, a lot of the load patterns and load usage. And can you maybe just talk about some of the processes and how you accommodated that, or what thinking kind of drove the changes to the model?
Sure. So when all of this started, we knew it would have some sort of impact, but being in uncharted territory, it's kind of like a double-edged sword because, you'd have, increased error because the load model does not know or has not experienced anything like this before. But every day that you were moving forward was kind of like, it's very beneficial in the sense of we're getting to see what this reaction is. It's not fun right now, but, it will ultimately end up, helping what we can try and, come up with to figure out what we can get the load model to do. So as mentioned earlier, a few of the observations that we noticed was, Amber, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember the exact number, but I believe there was like a 6 to 7% load reduction overall, like across the board, and even at peak for the Kaiso region. So that was, something. So the loads that were pulled were, a little bit lower than what they would normally be, than normalized for weather. So we had an idea of, what the magnitude impact was. And then, the other one, we started seeing too was the widening of that morning turn. You don't have people, again, waking up, showering, eating a piece of toast and running out the door or anything like that. You kind of, you've got a different behavior going on. There's no urgency to get out the door, and work is right here, and that commute is a little bit different. So, you've got the widening of that turn there. With that widening, you've got a different ramp rate that's occurring. So, that was, an interesting challenge that we ran into to try and, to try and work on that area as well. So,
one thing I'll jump in, because I know your question, Pam, was on the processes. Our processes and procedures that the forecasting team was running, we didn't change those. I just would say that they were in hyperdrive, right? Very fast-moving mode. The team, like Michael mentioned through the presentation, runs multiple models and different model configurations for each EIM entity. There's one model that's sent downstream, but behind the scenes there's multiple models that are there. That analysis, they do a deep analysis of all the models that are there every week. That already was part of our process. That didn't change. What changed is how fast we had to develop new models and trial new models, which we were calling COVID models. They had different configurations to them. Each entity had different COVID models we had to try very fast, and then move them through our environment to get them into production. And on our side, we do not, we don't typically move a model with like a brand new model within like a week. It's something that takes time. So all of those processes were there. Michael was at the forefront of them. I mean, we have all these EIM entities. Every one of you guys had at least 2 COVID models happening behind the scenes so we could find the right fit to help address what Michael was talking about, which is everybody's morning turn was impacted very differently. Everybody's peak was impacted differently. Everybody went into lockdowns at different times and prioritizing them. So process-wise, we didn't have to change our process and our procedure. It just had to move much more quickly than we normally would have to experience. And I'll pass it back. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, do you think the adoption of new modeling for COVID will create some lasting impacts or elasticity in your adaptability to future scenarios? I mean, it kind of, I think, forced a lot of us to adapt to a changing environment very rapidly, but are there some kind of lessons learned or process improvements that you might carry forward into the future?
I think the lesson learned that we had and processes is we are requiring IT to store a whole lot of data now. And I know that they always ask us, why do you forecasters need so much data? And now it's very clear answer why we like so much data and we have so much data. I think that the one thing that will get carried forward is maybe, in the past you guys, each entity would have 2 models that we were running in parallel. What we see now is there's 4. It really depends on entity and impact, but we even are carrying that forward in the analysis side of it. So yes, there's more automation that's there to run analysis on 5 models very quickly. Michael can speak to that as he automated it all. But then on top of it, we're just storing and know the criticality of storing so much data to go along with it. So I think that's the biggest piece. And I mean, at the end of the day, COVID is one moving target, but behind the meter, for a lot of the EIM entities, is another moving target. And we move and develop models just the same way. It's just a different outcome and thing we're chasing.
I believe we have a caller in the queue.
Yes, we do have a caller in the queue. I'm going on to that caller. All right, caller, your line is now unmuted.
Yeah, hi. This is Matt LeCar with Pacific Gas and Electric, and I had a question about some of the new prospective entrants that will be joining the EIM. So we've got, in the form of Colorado, New Mexico, Montana, several winter-heavy areas. As we've learned, winter forecasting is a different art that maybe could use some refinement. I'm curious, what you all are doing to prepare for that, and how much weather history you're able to obtain and look at, and what that'll do, in terms of the market dynamics once you've, got a forecast that includes that front range volatility. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Are you asking about the how we handle the different seasonality for the new entities, or like the diversity of?
Well, so specifically, I'm remembering when Arizona came on board that there was a lot of unfamiliarity with the monsoon pattern and quick developing cloud cover that you can get in the desert. This is yet a different twist where, now that we're expanding eastward into the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, you're going to be seeing different weather circulation patterns that come down, from the Canadian frozen tundra and can quickly propagate throughout the central U.S. and extend into, parts of Colorado, eastern Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, El Paso, which will be joining EIM in a few years, was heavily affected by the deep freeze, although they, did better than ERCOT. So I'm just curious, what that does to the toolkit, and maybe, what kinds of changes we might expect with the geographic footprint that's coming.
Sure. Thank you for that. So we have a very lengthy, onboarding period that we have with the entities, and we try to reach out to the entity very early on in the onboarding process to get things like historical load data. Basically pick the entity's brain on the weather station. What are some of the oddities of your load, if there are any, or are you winter or summer peaking? So we try to amass as much information as we can as possible, and then what we do is we take it back and we try to expand on that and say, okay, well, they say they use this weather station. What are the weather stations in the area? Would that be fruitful for us to maybe try and balance both of those? We do a deep scrub of that historical load data. We have periods of time where we go through and try to pick out some what I call them they're oddities, right? It's just something that I haven't seen that before. And so it's a conversation that we have with the entity to we go back and, hey, what's this for? Is this driven by weather? I see there might be some kind of correlation there. So that's kind of the pre onboarding sort of sense that we do. When it comes to these real-time events like the deep freeze in Texas, or any sort of heat events, the forecasting team, again with that on-site meteorologist, we are very aware of weather events that are coming down the pipe potentially. So we'd rather be safe and way too informed with all the various weather models out there, the GFS, the Euro. What are those guys saying? And as we get closer, we start to inform on our operations team. We start making the proper, communication lines with the entities and let them know that, hey, this is what we're currently seeing. We're watching it, and we're going to go from there. We just wanted to give you the heads up. So I think in the scope of that, I think it's enhanced communication that we offer both on our side with operations and the RTMO desk, as well as with the entity. So, the more information we can get, the better. We'd rather have too much than too little. I guess is right.
Yeah.
With that.
I want to do a quick trend check, and then I'll just tack on with that. I know that we are getting farther into the Eastern Connect. You got snow and some of the new events, but these are things, like Michael was saying, we track already with RC footprint and RC coordination. So even though you may not be getting a load forecast from us, the weather side of it is still getting updates for both Kaiso operational purposes, because they are gas impacted when some of these events come through, of course, just like everybody else, as well as RC. So that's all coming from the forecasting side of the house with the meteorology expertise that we have. And I know that I believe we're supposed to wrap up at 3. We didn't get to the renewable side yet, so I'll pass it to Pam to see what she wants to do as we go forward. We can go through the persistent forecast methodology. I know you guys have some questions on that if needed, or we can always come back and talk about those pieces or any other questions you guys have.
Well, I do think we are scheduled to end at 3. So I think we'll probably invite you back. How does that sound?
We always like coming to join you guys, so that's fine.
Well, you're such a great topic, and, forecasting really drives so much. It's the engine behind the market, or one of the many engines behind the market. So thank you. I know we had a couple other questions. If folks do have questions that we didn't get to, please, let your sector liaison know, and we'll pass those on to Amber. and her team. But thank you all for joining us today. I think this has been an excellent forum overall, and thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our participants.
All right, that concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.